My name is Bronnie Tate, B-R-O-N-N-I-E-T-A-I-T, and I'm interviewing Mr. Kurt Bernhard Lewinski, K-U-R-T-B-E-R-N-H-A-R-D-L-E-W-I-N-S-K-I. We're in Melbourne, Australia, and it's November the 18th, 1996. Can I ask your name, please?
Yes, Kurt Bernhard Lewinski.
And when were you born?
I was born 11th of December 1921.
And how old are you now?
74.
And where were you born?
I was born in a little provincial town called Marienwerder in Germany, part of East Prussia.
And what was your father's name?
My father's name was Jacques Lewinski.
And when was he born?
He was also born in Marienwerder.
When?
When 31st of January 1886.
And your mother?
My mother's name was Meta Lewinski. She was born in Königsberg on the 26th of January 1890.
And what was her maiden name?
Her maiden name was Jakobsthal.
And did you have brothers and sisters?
I did have two sisters. One is still alive in Toronto in Canada. The other one perished in the Holocaust.
And the one in Toronto, her name?
Her name is Thea Bertha O'Rourke.
And when was she born?
She was born 31st of October 1913.
And your sister? The other sister?
The other sister's name was Gerda. She was born the 19th of June 1919.
And where were they born?
They were both born in Marienwerder as well.
Now I'd like you to tell me a little bit of your life before the war. What kind of a boy were you?
That's a very difficult question to answer, because I was a model, I don't think, not at anybody else, but I think I like to think I was relatively normal, occasionally kicking over the traces, as young boys always do. But as a rule, I try to behave reasonably well.
Can you describe where you lived?
We lived, my parents had a clothing store in a little side street, and we had our flat, we lived above the store. We had plenty of room. Each child had his or her own room, and we lived a perfectly normal and happy life.
Do you remember the address?
Yes. The street name was Niedertor, and the street number was 5.
And did anybody else other than your family members live with you?
Yes, we did have a live-in chief cook and bottle washer, who was a lady, a Polish lady, who started in the employ of my parents just about the time they were married in 1913. And she stayed with us for over 25 years until my parents had to move away.
And can you describe the apartment, cooking facilities?
Cooking facilities, well, in those days microwaves and all that was unknown. It was, by today's standards, fairly primitive, but yet there was a stove, there was everything we needed. We had refrigerators, were again unknown, but there was something like an elaborate ice chest that worked perfectly well. But of course the climate was not very hot either, so there was no problem.
And bathroom?
Bathroom, everything was there. In fact, I can remember it being remodeled when I was in my early teens, brought up to date and modernized.
And can you describe the area, the surrounding area? The area in which you lived, the suburb?
Well, I wouldn't call it a suburb, because the whole town had 12,000 inhabitants and was even then a rather small provincial town. It was very close to the city center. Not right in it, but in a street that led off the city center and within easy walking distance to most of the shops that we needed.
Did you have extended family nearby?
I'm sorry?
Did you have extended family nearby?
No, we did have an uncle and his family about quarter of an hour's walk. They were the only relatives in town. We had plenty other relatives, but they were not living in that town.
What do you remember of your home life?
Well, I remember everything. We were a very happy family. We had a very happy childhood. We were not exactly millionaires, but then again, we also were not short of anything that we needed. I would describe it as comfortable middle class.
Were you religious?
Not really. We did go to synagogue on the major holidays, but I would not describe our family as Orthodox.
Did you celebrate the Yontifs?
Yes.
With extra family or just among yourselves?
No, usually my uncle and his family came, but that was it.
You mentioned you went to shul. Do you remember the rabbi's name?
Yes. He was, I don't know whether he was a qualified rabbi. I think today he would be called the reverend. And he was just about everything. He led the services in synagogue. He taught me for my bar mitzvah. And, he also did some of the cantor duties, singing, some of it, not all of it. And we went to synagogue, at least I did, once every week. One of the major reasons was that under Hitler the community started to shrink. They needed 10 people, and after my bar mitzvah I just had to go, otherwise they wouldn't have had a minyan.
And what was his name?
Rosenberg.
And did you know the chazan as well?
Yes, he assisted Rosenberg. His name was Blumenthal.
And where was the shul?
That was about 20 minutes walk from my home in another side street. First it was a bit nearer, but then that became, before the advent of Hitler, became a little bit too cramped, and the new one was built, and it was dedicated probably in the very early 30s, just before Hitler became Chancellor. And of course, because we built it because the community was expanding, and as soon as it was built, it started shrinking.
And where was it? Do you remember the name of the street?
Yes, it was the street was called Grüne Straße, which is Green Street.
What do you remember of your school life?
School life, well, I started in 28 to the primary school for 4 years. And quite happy there. Walked to school every day. And in 32 I was transferred to the gymnasium, which was a secondary school, where I stayed for another 6 years. And I had to learn Latin. That was the major language. I don't know why. Forgotten it all. And then I learned French 2 years later, which I loved, and forgotten it all. And a year later I was taught English, as luck would have it, by an officer in the Nazi storm troops. He gave me my basic knowledge of English.
And where did you learn that?
In
At
the
school?
gymnasium.
And from the gymnasium, where did you go to school?
Well, the gymnasium, I stuck it out till 1938, when I was 16. And then I had to leave anyway, and I went from Berlin, from the gymnasium. My father had booked me into a school in Berlin. It was run by an Ort committee, O-R-T. It was set up for the main purpose of teaching young Jewish boys a trade, and also to be instrumental in helping immigration as a school group. And there again in Berlin, I stayed at the Ort school for a year and a half. After the Kristallnacht, it became acute, and the school accelerated the move to England. But even so, from November 38, we finally left 27th of August 39, just in time.
How did you feel about being sent away from Marienwerder home with your family?
How did I feel about it? Well, it was a big step for a 16-year-old boy to take. I wasn't very happy, but I realized that it would have to be. And my parents arranged for me to stay with a distant uncle in Berlin and board with them. So I was with a family, slightly distant family, but they had a boy who was my age. In fact, he was one whole day older than I was. And we formed a friendship, and I had somewhere to stay, so I wasn't lonely. And my eldest sister was also in Berlin at the time, but she at that time was 25, and of course to her I was just a child. She would prefer to go out with boys. Can't say I blame her.
Did any of your other friends from the gymnasium or from your junior school move to Berlin as well?
I know of one, but he didn't stay very long, and then they emigrated to Palestine. And the twin sister of one of the boys from the gymnasium also moved to Berlin, and as luck would have it, happened to board in the same house that I later on lived in. Her twin brother had gone to Palestine before her.
And how did your younger sister feel?
I'm sorry?
How did your younger sister feel?
She was not very happy because she stayed behind in Marienwerder and then moved with my parents to Berlin after Kristallnacht in December 38, when I moved back in with the family again for a few months.
Did you enjoy school in Berlin?
Yes, I must say I did. We learned something, although it was slightly boring to be filing a block of steel for about 6 months every day. It had to be exact. But the larger picture was, after all, I know that the school, apart from teaching us a trade, also helped to get us out of Germany, and that was the main aim.
And what trade were you actually being taught?
Engineering, mechanics, precision mechanics. Not that I got very far, but that's another story.
What were your favorite pastimes?
Well, in those days, I think I had started stamp collecting, and we could not really live a normal life as Jewish boys under Nazi Germany. You couldn't do the things that the others would do. You couldn't go to dances and all that sort of thing. So it was mainly visiting with friends, and they also occasionally, we could go to the movies. Again, there was a Jewish picture house. It was set up because Jews couldn't go to the cinema anymore. So we could go there for concerts and films, and about once a week or once every 2 weeks we went, and it was a nice change.
This was within Marienwerder?
Hmm?
Within Marienwerder?
I'm sorry, I'm talking about Berlin. Sorry, going back to Marienwerder,
Yes.
You couldn't go to the movies after 1935. In fact, you couldn't go to any of the shops because they posted signs up that we don't serve Jews. So for the day-to-day food requirements, my mother usually sent somebody who worked in our shop to buy the food for the family. And on weekends, we hopped in the car and drove to another town 40 kilometers away called Marienburg. And there we went to the movies. Or in the summer, we went a bit further, 100 kilometers, to Danzig, which was outside Germany. And there we were free and could do anything we liked until our passports were taken away in 1937. That was the end of that.
You said you had a car,
Yeah.
family.
Yeah.
Did you go to special places?
With a car?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yes, especially on weekends, of course, we drove around in the area to have a good look where we lived, and it was quite interesting. And sometimes we had a man working in the shop who was the general factotum, and he also drove the car. And lunchtime, he very often drove us and with friends to a nearby forest where we relaxed, could go for a walk, played in the forest, and did all sorts of the stupid sort of things that young teenage boys do.
And how did the Nazi influence
Yes.
change the way you lived as a child?
Well, I was 11 when the Nazis came to power, and at first we didn't feel very much. They took a little while to really make their presence felt, although about 3 months after they came to power, they had the famous Day of Boycott, where they put stormtroopers in front of every Jewish shop and didn't let people in. And we enjoyed that a lot of our customers who've been shopping for years came and just shouldered them aside and still went in. But gradually, of course, the news tightened. For instance, we had diagonally opposite us, there was a watchmaker's shop, and the watchmaker was a good party member, and he got the job of standing outside his shop because he didn't do much business, and he noted down everybody that went into the shop, and they were reported. I had a few teachers who were sympathetic to us, and when I went to secondary school, they took me aside and said, listen, I need a jumper, I need a pair of slacks size so-and-so, could you bring it along? We did. So I played delivery boy as well, because they knew that their names would be noted and their jobs would be in danger if they were seen coming into the shop.
And what type of a business did your father have?
It was general clothing stores, ladies and men's clothing, underwear, napery, drapery, all that sort of thing, ladies' fashions. My mother ran the ladies' department, and my father ran the store generally as a whole.
And what language did you speak at home?
Oh, German. We were good patriotic Germans.
And did the relationship between the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community change?
It changed over the years. At first it was, you didn't notice any change, but every year it got tighter. Every year more people moved away from you because their own existence could be threatened. And of course in a small town, it's not like a city like Berlin. In a small town, everybody knew everybody else. And one reported on the other. It was very nicely set up by the Nazis.
What about your school friends?
The school friends also, over time, drifted away from me, but I must say that there was one or two who stuck by me. One I particularly remember. His father was a Freemason, and he really defied authorities and didn't mind being seen with me. In fact, he is today, lives in Munich, and I'm still in touch with him. He's a retired doctor. And funnily enough, although the gymnasium was a boys' school, in the last year, one girl was admitted. And it became embarrassing, not because she was a girl, but because of the racial laws that Jews are not supposed to be associated with females. And I couldn't get rid of her because it would have been dangerous for her and for me.
Did you go to Cheder at all?
Did I?
Go to Cheder at all? Need Jewish instruction?
Not really, no. Not orthodox enough for it.
Did you or anyone in your family belong to any organization?
Yes, I did belong to a youth organization for Jewish boys and girls, and we had our outings, and we met, the synagogue had rooms for social mingling, and there we had put on shows or readings, or and we got together that way. And my father, of course, was belonging to a lodge. I can't recall what lodge it was anymore. Yes, he did belong to organization.
What was the name of your youth organization?
Well, I can only remember the initials, BDJJ. I'm not sure what it stands for. It's something to do with Jewish youth.
Did you hear news from other parts of Europe?
Did I have news?
Yes, about what was happening elsewhere.
Very little. I did correspond with a friend in France and with a cousin in Holland, mainly for the purpose of exchanging stamps. But of course, again, we all knew that mail was being censored, and they and we had to be fairly cagey in what we wrote.
Did you or your family ever attempt to leave Germany?
Well, we attempted to, but the main problem was that you had to find a country that was willing to take you. And initially, when it was relatively easy, unfortunately, my father, in common with a lot of German Jews, made the mistake of saying, well, you know, it'll blow over. There's no need to emigrate. We'll be all right. And by the time that we realized that it wasn't going to blow over. A lot of the countries had closed their doors or at least made it rather difficult to get in. In fact, at one thing, when I was in Berlin in '38, I saw a movie, Broadway Melody, which part was taken by Sophie Tucker, who was Jewish. And I wrote to her and said, is there anything you can do? I never got a direct reply, but I heard later on from a distant cousin who lived in New York that they went to a Jewish aid organization, and there was my name, and it was forwarded onto there by Sophie Tucker.
Now, when you went to Berlin initially to be in the art school, did you still have contact with your parents?
Oh yes, oh yes. When I went to Berlin, not only did I write letters, but even under instructions, I even sent my dirty laundry to Marienwerder so that it could be washed and returned to me every second week. Because I must admit, in retrospect, I was spoiled rotten, being the youngest and being the only boy.
So you said your family came to Berlin.
Yes.
While you were still at school.
Yes.
And then you said the school was organising for you to leave.
Right.
What sort of organisation? What?
Well,
by
the
whom?
school was really owned by a British committee, so the Nazis couldn't touch it. They couldn't confiscate it because it was British property. And it was set up by agreement with, of all people, the famous or infamous Adolf Eichmann, who consented that the school was set up because one of the undertakings, one of the contracts was that the school arranged to transfer out of Germany. But of course, our original plan was to transfer all the machinery, all the teachers, all the pupils. And it only accelerated after Kristallnacht. They managed to get most, but not all of the teachers out, and only 100 of the 250 boys. And that only just in time.
Who was the main instigator of?
The English committee was headed by an English colonel because Eichmann would only consent to negotiate with them on condition that it was a military man, an officer, whom he could negotiate with. And this guy was an officer, he had a couple of gongs, and he was a hero of the First World War, so Eichmann contracted with him. And he was working from the English end to get us out.
And how was it the selection made?
That is a good question. I think it was the main idea of the pupils was on a basis of seniority. There were quite a few who progressively, while they were amongst the first 100, their parents worked on getting them out on their own, and quite a few dropped out because they emigrated with their parents before the school did. So their places could be taken by more junior pupils who joined a little later.
Can you describe the farewell with your parents?
Well, the farewell with the parents took place in our home because they said that they didn't want any parents to come to the station, which was a suburban Berlin railway station. In retrospect, I'm rather glad because it would have been pandemonium. It was bad enough as it was because apart from the 100 boys, you also had other people, the normal local suburban traffic, and you had other people who also wanted to emigrate via that train. And it was pandemonium. They also had quite a few Gestapo people there surveying it all. And the heroes of our migration was the business manager of the school, who really, in the finish, got so exasperated that he yelled at the Gestapo people. And when I saw that, I thought, my God, they're going to arrest him any minute. They didn't then. They did later.
And how did you feel?
On the one hand, happy to get out, but that was largely overshadowed by having to leave my parents behind. Because at that time, the panic was already on. You knew something was going to happen. You had, it was a Sunday night. Next Friday, they invaded Poland. Diplomacy was going full tilt, envoys were flying forwards and backwards, my sister Thea, who was by that time in London, rang us up and said, "You've got your passport, you've got your visa, if the school doesn't go, you go, get out." So I guess that there was something brewing, even if we didn't know, because the media were government controlled. They didn't say that there was going to be war, but it was after the Germans made their agreement with Moscow, which was a complete turnaround.
So what date was it that you left?
We left the 27th of August, 39.
Did you know where you were going?
Yeah, we knew we were going to England.
You said your sister was already in England.
She was in England. She left in March 39. She went out. She was a trained secretary, worked for 6 years as a secretary, and finished up as a domestic scrubbing floors in London. But it got out.
And your parents?
Parents couldn't make it anymore. They had tried a few things, but number one, you needed to deposit money in a foreign country. In some countries, other countries, you know, the whole thing strung out. It took ages. In fact, partly the Nazis sabotaged the efforts of Jews to emigrate by that time. First, they wanted to get out while you can, and then they made it more difficult because they knew that if people stayed, I mean, they probably had their plan already done, that they could confiscate their property and God knows what. And
your parents, did your father sell the business in Marienwerder?
He was forced, well, selling is a bit of an exaggeration. I think you could say he was practically forced to give it away. That was just concluded just before Kristallnacht. In fact, there was quite an episode. My father was still in Berlin negotiating, and my mother was in Marienwerder, knew that the sale had been made. And along came Kristallnacht, the stormtroopers appeared, smashed the windows, got my mother down, said, "Open up the front door," because that was heavily barred, and they started to smash it up. My mother said, "Go ahead. I love seeing you do that." "Oh, you crazy? Why? What?" "Oh, it belongs to one of your party members." They stopped immediately.
Can you describe your journey to England?
To England? Yes. The train stopped almost every hour, if not more often, because it always had to let troop trains pass. You could see the trains pass, packed with soldiers and guns and tanks and whatnot, going to the French border. So that even confirmed us in smelling that something was going to happen. But we made it to Cologne, and in Cologne at the station, the next train wasn't there. What happened? We can't be stuck in Cologne. And then the word came through, well, you can walk around Cologne, don't go far, you've got to be back here in 3 hours. So we had a good look around the Cologne station and the big cathedral, but we didn't dare go any further. And we reported back, and luckily a train came in and said, "That's our train, we go on there."
We'll just break here and we'll change tapes.
Okay.
Tape 2 with Mr. Kurt Lewinski. You were in Cologne on the train.
Right. We're on the train now, moving towards the Dutch border. And when we get to the border, the train stopped, and the German customs people, who at that time were already in the black SS uniform with just customs, green customs armbands, they looked at our passports, they had a good look around, and one of them, in the best Nazi method, said, "Well, in 3 minutes, we'll be glad to be rid of you, and you'll be glad to be out of here." And we all said, "Amen." And as we moved across the border, you could see the post there, the border post. Some of us had postcards written on the train. It said, "Right, I'm writing this from Holland." And we threw it out the window, hoping it would reach our parents. A few did, were picked up by Dutch people and posted. And I don't know whether mine ever did get back, but then again, we got to Flushing, the Dutch port, where again we had to wait for the ship to come to ship us over to England. Then it was quite an uneventful trip. We landed in Harwich, where examined by the British immigration authorities, and put on a train to London.
How long was the train trip from Berlin to
Train
the
trip
coast?
from Berlin, we got to, well, we left Berlin at 10 p.m. and we got to Cologne, if I remember correctly, about 9:30 a.m., which was longer than a normal train trip because of the frequent stops. And then we had a gap till 1 o'clock before we left Cologne again. I'm a little bit hazy about the times and Flushing and on the boat. Anyway, we got to London. It would have been about 11 p.m. And as we got off the train, can you imagine a group of 100 boys, round about 17 most of us, with a few aged 18, marching through Whitechapel, which was largely populated by Jews, in the dead of night, singing German marching songs. Not Nazi songs, but and you could see the windows above our heads opening, and people scared stiff because the atmosphere was already very, very tense, to say the least. And I mean, we were, looking back, we were complete idiots to do it. But at the time, we thought we were wonderful, the heroes. Well, then they got us to a place where we could get bed and breakfast. Next morning, we had a half an hour, and then before we knew where we were, a lot of the local population came along and brought us loaves of bread and grapes and milk, because words got around that they were Yiddish Bochers from Germany, which made us feel that small after our experiences the previous night. And we were overwhelmed. You know, we were eating and drinking all the way from London to the Kitchener camp, which was quite I think it was 3 or 4 hours, if I remember rightly. We were eating all the time. Well, then, of course, we got to the Kitchener camp, which was an old army camp from the First World War, and was no longer used, and there were 3,500 German and Austrian refugees housed there temporarily. And we were there for about 3 months because the hostel wasn't ready. We just left too early for the hostel.
What did you do while you were there?
Well, somehow someone or something inspired me to volunteer for work in the kitchen, washing dishes for 3,500 people. But it had one good advantage, because the food was not all that wonderful, nor was it plentiful. The famous saying was the food was poison in such small portions too. But being in the kitchen, you could wait until the better type food, which the staff members got, came back, that was left over, and we pounced on that. And that was our good meal, and there was sense in my volunteering for the kitchen.
Did you share with others?
Hmm?
Did you share with others?
Oh yes, oh yes. Gladly, and good friends, and I mean there was plenty of it. So very happy to have been able to show generosity. We even got a pocket money of 6 pence a week, which doesn't sound much, but in those days was a small fortune.
What did you spend it on?
Well, we had a canteen, and we could either buy cigarettes, although at that time I wasn't smoking yet, that came much later, well, lollies or chocolates. And we had also, we were allowed to take 10 German marks out of Germany with us, which translated into about 17 English shillings. But not all the boys had 10 marks, some were from poorer families. So we pooled our resources and shared it, and everybody got 10 shillings. So we had a little bit of private capital, which didn't last very long.
Can you describe your surroundings at the camp?
Well, the camp, you've seen one camp, you've seen them all. They were big army huts, forget how many, but they were huge. And there was nothing around the camp. Occasionally, the nearest town was called Sandwich. named after the Earl of Sandwich. Or and we walked there because you couldn't do much there. You couldn't go shopping, but you could have a cup of tea if you ate into your capital or into your weekly pocket money. And it was an very small town, very old-fashioned. You know, the houses sort of almost met in the upper stories. It was very picturesque, but we knew that we wouldn't be staying there for long, but we did stay for about 3 months. In between, in November, my sister, who worked her butt off as a domestic and did earn a very minimal salary, did send me money, and it allowed me to take the bus to London and visit her for a few days. And the family she worked for had a room and had a bed for me, and that was heaven, to be with a family member.
Did you see her often?
Hmm?
Did you see her often?
No, unfortunately I didn't. I saw her very briefly when our train from Harwich pulled in at Liverpool Street Station. She was on the station. She had been in touch with the British Committee, and she knew when we'd be coming. But then we had to go on again, and that was only a matter of 10 minutes. But then I saw her in November for 4 or 5 days, and again in round about Christmas time when we finally moved from the Kitchener camp to our hostel in Leeds. There again, I stayed in London for 2 or 3 days. And after that, I didn't see her for about 24 years.
So you had no schooling while you were there?
In the Kitchener camp, no. We had English classes, but nothing else.
So where did you move to next?
From Leeds, from the Kitchener camp, we moved to Leeds, which at that time had 10% Jewish population. So there was a good base for us to be based in. And they had a hostel split into various buildings along one road. And I moved into a building. There was huge grounds, and in the grounds there were 2 cottages. I moved into what was called the Green Cottage, which had 3 rooms with 6 men, 6 boys each. And we were away from supervision. Because for main meals and everything, we had to go to the main hostel where there was the teacher and the hostel masters and all that. But in the Green Cottage, we were on our own. And we had one who, you could almost call him the entrepreneur. He promptly proceeded, he had a good look around, and he found that there were lead facings around the windows and along the gutters. He promptly found somebody who was, he could sell the lead too, so we practically demolished all the guttering. But he pocketed the major proceeds. As a matter of fact, he was modern turned. He stayed in Leeds and became, well, the modern equivalent of some of our more modern entrepreneur on a slightly smaller scale. In the finish, his son-in-law took a pot shot at him and missed, but he died very early, cancer or something, died in his 40s, after he owned a white Rolls Royce.
What was his name?
Werner Katz, K-A-T-Z.
And when did you move to Leeds?
We moved to Leeds Christmas '39. It was a very severe winter, and I've still got some sketches or photos where the snow was really very high on the ground. And because we were told this was the severest winter for decades. But then later on in the spring, the snow melted and it became beautiful.
And how long were you there?
We were there till 25th of June, 1940. And there again we thought history was repeating itself, because the moment the Holland and Belgium and France were invaded, our existence became once again a bit jittery, because there was a propaganda campaign. We've got too many Germans, and the fifth columnists, and the parachutists, and they're going to betray us all, and we should be interned, and all this. And we were graded, let's go even back to the Kitchener camp, all refugees were put into categories, A, B, and C. Now, not just the boys from the old school, but anybody with an A grading was interned immediately, was considered dangerous. Anybody with a B grading was left free, but had to report to police could not move more than something like 5 miles, if I remember rightly. Sea, we're completely free. Well then, after the invasion of France, we had to hand in cameras, radio sets, bicycles, so that we could not be mobile or couldn't do anything. You know, you started to get reports filtering through. In France, where Germans were posing as tourists, were easing the entry of the German army. So England didn't want to risk it, which in retrospect I can well understand. At the time I wasn't very happy. And the propaganda campaign mounted. And after France surrendered, by that time we had started to build up the workshop. The hostel was set up, but we were fitting out the workshop, setting up machinery and all that so that the teaching could go on. And then a few detectives arrived and called just one boy out. You've got to come with us, you're about to be interned. Great big uproar. My God, we're going to have a football match this weekend. He is the football star. If he's there, we have to cancel the match. But then more and more detectives appeared, and they called one after the other. My turn too. Drove us back to the hostel to collect whatever meager belongings we had, change of underwear, and a pair of socks, and come with us, and we finished up at Leeds Town Hall, where we met most of the old boys, but not all, because they only interned the ones that were 18 years or over. If your birthday was later, if you weren't 18, you couldn't possibly be a spy for the Nazis.
And what happened next?
Well, from Leeds, they sent us by bus to York, where they had set up a temporary camp on the racecourse behind barbed wire. Once again, I volunteered for the kitchen, which was a very good move. After a week, they sent us from York to Douglas on the Isle of Man. No volunteering for the kitchen, all jobs were already taken. And there we met for the first time people who had lived in England all their lives, but neglected to become naturalized. And they were interned. They didn't even speak German.
Did you have any contact at this stage with your parents?
Not at that. I did until the fall of France, because we had a cousin of my mother's in Holland who relayed mail both ways. But once Holland was occupied, that was the end of it. Later on in Australia, as an internee, I could use prisoner of war mail. That we resumed contact again.
What did you do on the Isle of Man?
Very little. There's nothing much we could do. I think they set up again language classes to improve our English a little bit, and walking around the camp perimeter and talking. It's about all you could do. But that was then again only for 1 week. And of course in the Isle of Man, you could, it was not a race course, it was right in the holiday resort center. You could see the population walk by and trams going by. So at least there was some diversion. Not much, but a little bit.
Were you afraid?
Afraid? In some ways, yes, because before we were interned, we heard all the stories about Dunkirk, the British Army evacuation, how all rifles and armaments had to be left behind. And when we saw British soldiers drilling with broomsticks instead of rifles, I said, my God, how are they going to stop the Nazis if they start an invasion? Having seen their might on the train and, you know, guns and tanks. And we got the jitters. You know, by that time they've conquered a large part of Europe. And they said, are broomsticks going to stop them? Luckily they did. Rather, the Air Force did.
How did you get your information about what was happening in Europe?
In the internment camp we didn't get much, but before internment we read papers. In fact, going back a little bit, one of the first panics I had in the Kitchener camp, at the day war was declared, I saw a poster of the, you know how the newspaper posters are, where they just give you a few words, and it said, war declared, England collapses. And my God. I found out later on, England collapsed, it was a cricket match.
So, what did they tell you was going to happen to you while you were on the Isle of Man?
Well, on the Isle of Man, I don't think that the government had really fully made up its mind. But then they said, right, we are going to ask people to move out of England. And we were halfway towards that decision, but there's nothing we could contribute to it. If we don't get enough volunteers, we'll take all the young ones without business ties, without family ties, and ship them away anyway. And the talk was only to Canada. We signed on the dotted line because we're going to go anyway, whether voluntary or otherwise. So we signed, right, I'm willing to go to Canada. Besides, at the back of our mind, was the fact that from Canada to the States is not very far. So we volunteered. They shipped us out of the camp into a transit camp near Douglas, and the next morning we're going to go back to Liverpool on the ship. While we were in that transit camp, it was only just a big hall. All of a sudden people came, they looked pretty bedraggled. Yes, that was a transport they returned. A ship was torpedoes, and they are the survivors. Now that really put us in a good frame of mind, and there was no going back.
So you weren't going to Canada?
Well, then we found that out later on. At that stage, we were convinced we were going to go to Canada.
What happened next?
Next, they put us on a little ship back to Liverpool. On the Liverpool, on the quayside, oh, big ship. That looks like a good ship. Yeah, that's the ship you go on. Okay. So we walk up the gangplank. Everybody has a little bag or some belongings. All of a sudden, their hands were empty. It was yanked away from them. And you had soldiers with bayonets frisking you. You got any knives, watches, anything. We didn't quite know what was happening, but we were about to be robbed.
Were these English soldiers?
English soldiers. That was a culture shock. We didn't expect it. Internment, okay. Getting out, okay. Well, they told the soldiers that we were Nazi spies. And
Who told?
A lot, well, the army officers. And some of the soldiers were Dunkirk veterans, so they had no love for Germans. And others were just rebel or criminals who sort of were just good for guarding internees, nothing, not much else.
But you were 18-year-olds.
18.
How many people boarded with you?
Well, we boarded in groups. Altogether, there were about 2,500 on the Dunera. They came in troops and drops from all sorts of camps from all over England. We're still going to Canada.
You still thought so?
We had nothing to do, no knowledge otherwise, and they didn't tell us.
And when was this? The date?
10th of July, 40. Then the ship started to move. I forget when it was. It must have been the next day or the day after. I could probably read it back in my diary. All of a sudden, there was a hell of a bang. I had just become seasick. Just about everybody around me was seasick. We were downstairs. You couldn't go upstairs. We were completely done in. All of a sudden, the bang. Ah, torpedo. Oh, well. What do I care? I don't feel like anything anyway. Another bang. Another torpedo. One's not enough. Oh, well, I suppose I better drag myself. You could then go upstairs, but you couldn't get out of the barbed wire. And I thought, no, if it's a torpedo, the ship should really, you know, it didn't. The engines went on, the ship went on, and everything stayed calm. We found out later on, luckily they didn't explode. There was all sorts of research done, why and how come. I couldn't care less. The main thing is they didn't explode. Otherwise I wouldn't be here. There would have been no Dunera boys.
Can you describe life aboard the Dunera?
I can laugh now. That wasn't funny. they had what they call mess decks. They were fixed tables with fixed benches, and if you were lucky, you got a hammock and you could hook it up and you could sleep there at night. I wasn't quite quick enough. It's the story of my life. I'm never quick enough for these things. I finished up lying on the floor, getting some sort of palliasse or mattress, I wouldn't call it, and you lie there. And later on, as the ship went on and it went like this, you know, you moved up and you moved down and you moved up. And the palliasse and the hammock, of course, they were quite comfortable. But we were somewhat crowded, to put it mildly. Then the food was brought in from the kitchen. They had a few people that were detailed that brought it in big containers. You had tin plates and you had some sort of fork, and it was never enough anyway for growing 18-year-olds. So you starved from one meal to the next. And it got to that stage. The sweets were particularly good. They get sago. It was just loose sago boiled, no taste at all. And most of them said, "No, I don't eat that." I said, "Okay, you don't want it, I'll eat it. Anything to fill up." So I can't say I starved. The next thing was shaving. We had no razors, we had nothing, no toothpaste. One guy managed to salvage a razor, and another had a bit of shaving soap. So that had to do for about 3 dozen boys, because the blade was blunt on the second day, but it lasted for 8 weeks. So we finished, a lot of them grew beards.
They still haven't told you where you're going?
No. But we were lucky. The bulk of the guys were in the front of the ship and were below deck, couldn't get out, except for half-hour exercise period during the day, where they were chased around the decks barefoot, and some of our Nazi guards smashed beer bottles here, walked through that. On the rear ship, we were very lucky because we could get up on deck and get fresh air. Still behind barbed wire, but you could look out, and you could see that you were in convoy. There were ships all around you, going to America, Canada. One morning we came up and all the convoys gone, we were on our own. And within a few days the weather started to get warm. Really warm. I mean, it was July, it was summer, but on the ocean it's not all that warm. But it got really warm. And we had also about 200 German merchant marine seamen there. And they were pretty cluey as far as, you know, the area. And said, "We're not going to Canada. We think we're going to Africa." Africa? What do we do in Africa? Next thing we know, we docked in Freetown in Sierra Leone, the west coast of Africa.
Who was guarding you?
Hmm?
Who was guarding you?
British soldiers. I mean, that story has been well documented, the Dunera story. I could give you books on that. A lot of research done. And the officers were not gentlemen either. That's why.
So how long were you on the boat?
8 weeks. 8 weeks. We landed in Sierra Leone, then we landed in the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. Then we landed in Cape Town, because we couldn't leave the ship. They just took on water and supplies. Then we landed in Fremantle. And slowly the Australian authorities started to find out what happened to us, and they raised a bit of a ruckus. And then gradually conditions became tolerable. And when we finally docked in Sydney, Fremantle, then Melbourne, and then we went on to Sydney. And in Sydney we were put on a train and sent to Hay. And in Hay we noticed the difference, where the Aussie soldiers, you know, the Dad's army guarding us with bayonets. We stopped at a wayside station, and it's a well-known story, but I've also seen it. It happened more than once. "Yeah, here, hold my rifle, I'll just go and get myself a cup of tea." He came back loaded up with lollies for us or something.
When did you know you were coming to Australia?
I think when we guessed it in the west coast of Africa, and it was confirmed in Cape Town. In Cape Town, there was also, somebody was taken off. I don't know where he was, but I saw him going down the gangplank. He really was a Nazi who was interned in South Africa, sent to Britain, put on the Donera, and offloaded again in South Africa. And when all the Nazis gathered around him, gave the Nazi salute and sang the Horst Wessel song, we knew that he was not one of us.
Did you know his name?
I think the name was something like Kittel, and I wouldn't swear to it. He must have been somebody high up. The less we knew of him, the better.
Did you know anything of Australia?
Yes, there were kangaroos and koalas, and I've heard of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which, when going back again to the early 1930s, when I saw a photo of it being built, the famous photo with the two arches nearly meeting. My father looked over my shoulder and said, well, you're looking at that, you'll never get to see it. And in Sydney, the Donera drove under it.
What was your English like at that stage?
Well, I could understand people. I could express myself somewhat haltingly, but I was quite proud that when I went to the movies, I could get the gist of it. I missed a few words here and there. The subtleties escaped me, but gradually I think that I had enough grounding. I mean, I had 3 years in school and then private tuition and a bit in Leeds and further courses on the Donera and in the camp. I was relatively fluent. The accent never left me.
We'll just break for a change of tape.
Okay.
Tape 3 with Mr. Kurt Lewinski. The Doneras landed in Sydney.
Yep.
What happened next?
Well, we got onto a train and were sent to Hay, and it was a novel experience to go along in a train, to be treated as human beings again, and as we go along to look out the window and see kangaroos pacing the train and getting there first. Now after we arrived at Hay, it was miles from anywhere, all we could see was sand, because it was a period of drought, and it was completely dry. And from the station we marched to the camp, and the first thing we got is the best meal I've ever had in my life, a tin pannikin full of a cup of tea and a sandwich, just white bread, butter and cheese on it. It was delicious after the Donera.
When did you actually arrive in Sydney?
In Sydney on the 6th of September, 1940.
And how long was your train journey?
If I remember rightly, something like 16 hours. It sounds very long to me, but then maybe it was a slow train.
And was this everybody from the Donera?
No, quite a few people were offloaded in Melbourne. The German seamen, the Italian civil internees, and the, what they call the Arandora Star survivors. They were the people that survived, that were salvaged from that torpedo ship that we met in Douglas. For some reason, they were offloaded in Melbourne and went to Tatura. Later on, we rejoined them in Tatura. At that stage, they were away, apart from us.
So you now had Australian soldiers guarding you?
Now we had Australian soldiers guarding us, and they soon got used to us.
What were your first impressions of arriving at the Hay camp?
My first impression is, where the hell have we landed? There's nothing here, except the camp stuck in the middle of a desert. We couldn't see the township, we couldn't see anything. And to make matters worse, we found out that it was a camp designed to hold 1,000 internees, and there were 2,000 in it. But there was another camp being built within walking distance, although we couldn't see it, where they went to sleep, but nothing else was ready. No food, no toilet facilities were ready. That was still being built, so they had to come to us. I think it was a matter of a couple of weeks. until they finally left. And in a way, we had to say goodbye to a number of friends for quite a while because we had no contact after that for 8 months.
How were you divided up?
I have no idea what they went by. Can't remember. If I had only known, because my future brother-in-law was amongst the crowd that went to the other camp. I never met him. I met him here in Melbourne after he came visiting us, not in the camp.
Did you talk much
We did
with the
nothing
boys?
better.
What did you talk about?
Anything. Politics, history, and before very long they set up a camp school. We had a lot of very highly educated and cultured people. We had artists, we had university professors, and they set up a camp school where you could learn all sorts of things. And before long, the school linked up with Melbourne University or Sydney University, I don't know what. I wasn't one of the academics. And they continued their studies per long distance. But all this took a few months to set up. Gradually, a few things started to come in. The Australian authorities realized before the British authorities that we were really on the side of the Allies and not on the side of the Germans.
What was the atmosphere like among the internees?
Well, the atmosphere, I think the first thing was, let's make life livable. The next thing was, all right, now life is livable. What can we do, not just to while the time away, but to use the time that we're here? Because at that time we didn't know, was it going to be for the duration or was it going to be what? We didn't know. Then it took months and months. We were then allowed to send mail through prisoner of war mail to relatives wherever, and gradually connections were taken up again. And of course we also said that we shouldn't really be here. We want to help. But it took a while because the Australian government said, well, we can't do anything. We just house you and feed you. You're the responsibility of the British government. The British government was fighting the Battle of Britain. They were rather busier than worrying about 2,000 internees stuck in Australia, which is understandable. But then stories started to filter through, and there were debates in Parliament, both in London and in Canberra. And like anything the governments do, it doesn't happen overnight.
Were you still with some of your original Ort boys?
Yes, the Ort boys.
Were you all positive in your feelings?
Yes.
Nobody...
Well, we all whinged. Nobody liked being stuck there. And we all found plenty of faults with the way things were. So, but we also realized there was nothing we could do to get out. Although we yelled and protested and complained and did anything that we could do in conjunction with the other internees, that we shouldn't really be here.
What did you want to do?
I think in all honesty at that stage, I think I must say I didn't really know myself. The first thing is to win the war, or to get rid of the war, to finish the war, before we can go back to anything like a civilian occupation. Because while the war was on and we were at military age, we knew that whatever we do, we'd like to contribute something. And a lot of the people did. Later on, there was a Major Leighton sent out from England to consider the case, to find out what they can do to help, to either get us out in Australia, or quite a few of the boys signed to join the British Army. And they were transported back when shipping was available. And that was quite a job in those dark days of 1940, 41, 42. We weren't winning too many battles then.
Did you, at this stage, think you wanted to go back to your family?
Well, I wanted to see my family again, wherever. Whether I wanted to go back to Germany was left open to discussion. I would have preferred to have been able to get my family out, but while the war was on, there was no way.
Did you get mail from them at this stage?
Yes. Not in the initial stages, but I think in 41 it started, I got a reply. First we got messages back to England. We are alive. We are in Australia. We are well. We have enough to eat. You know, you could write 25 words or something like that. Then one day you could send a message through the good offices of the Vatican. And can you imagine my parents getting a message from the Vatican, from his son? Then until Pearl Harbor, we also could correspond. We had a friend in New York, a family friend. I wrote to him. He wrote to my parents. And then we found that as we could use prisoner of war mail, so we wrote direct. But I mean, a letter took about 4 months to get here.
And what news did you hear from your family?
Well, they had to be very careful what they wrote. They couldn't write anything against the Nazis because all mail was censored. But we are well, and we've heard from Auntie Emma, and my other sister Gerda moved and got married in November 1940, and she moved to Stuttgart, and all the sort of family news. And we have enough to eat, although occasionally it's not quite like it used to be. Well, that told me volumes.
Was there any sort of code way of saying anything?
Well, there probably was. The only thing that I set up is if I asked you how is Aunt Rachel, it meant have you got enough to eat? And if I asked how is Uncle Richard, does it mean that what's the persecution like? Is his health okay? And he said, well, Aunt Rachel isn't too well, but she's managing to maintain reasonable health. And Uncle Richard, well, there's always something new cropping up, but so far, again, he is managing. Well, that's all they could write.
How did you work that system out?
I really can't remember how and why. Somehow, before I left home, I think I even used that same system when I wrote when I was in Berlin and my parents were still in Marienwerder. I used that. And when I left home, I said, well, can we use that same system again? We didn't. It happened so suddenly. We didn't have time to elaborate, to go further. So we left it at that.
So what else did you do while you were in Hay?
In Hay, out of sheer boredom, I took lessons, classes in sketching. I had a bit of tuition from sculptors. I developed my habit of wood carving. And I found to have something which I never knew I had, a certain talent for, well, not sculpture, but wood carving, doing figures, craft work, and that sort of thing. And there were plenty of people who could give me advice and hints how to develop it. And I really could say they were my schooling years for wood carving, which I've kept on as a hobby. Never made any money out of it. Although I did in the camp, yes. I did make articles there, and we had a few people who had money sent to them. They were very good customers. Well, most of the guys who worked for the camp laundry and whatever, got 6 pence a week pocket money. I managed usually to reach the dizzy heights of 2 shillings or even 2 and 6 once in a while. So it was almost capitalist.
Where did you get your implements from?
Well, the implement was a pocket knife. I had nothing in the beginning. Later on, in Tatura, they set up a camp workshop, which was for the highly skilled people, but they tolerated me to come in and occasionally use the tools, because that was sheer heaven.
Where did you get the wood?
Initially in Hay, the huts were made from timber, and I picked up the offcuts that were lying around from when the huts were built. Again, later on, they had bits of timber coming in for all sorts of reasons. So I found enough, but everything was on a very small scale, because the timber was on a very small scale.
And were you able to leave the camp?
Not as a rule. They did have once or twice in Hay, they had swimming parties where they marched us to the nearby Murrumbidgee River, and we could cool off and swim in the height of summer. I can only remember having been there once or twice. There were others, I think, that on a very small scale went out on some sort of working party. I can't even remember what it was for. But by that time I was so tied up with my carving. I said, well, you go on your working party, I'll do the carving.
You said your case had been taken away from you as you boarded the Dunera. What clothing did you have?
Not very much. What I was wearing, a pair of pants and a shirt and a jumper and a pair of socks. And I wore that for 8 weeks.
Did they get washed?
Oh yes. We washed it in a way, salt water with very little soap. And soap can only be used very sparingly because I think we only got one piece for about a dozen men once a week, sort of thing.
So when you got to Hay, what clothing?
We were then issued clothing by the army. Funny enough, slacks and jackets made from denim, blue jeans. And greatcoats were old army greatcoats dyed burgundy. We got socks and woolen shirts. I mean, it was better than what we had on the Dunera anyway.
So how long were you in Hay?
In Hay we were for 8 months, and it was up to 40 degrees in summer, in daytime, and it went to, well, it felt like below zero in the night. And in between you had sandstorms, and there was sand all around, and it didn't need much wind, and the whole thing was covered in sand. If you can imagine, the huts were built from timber, but there was a gap for ventilation between the ceiling and the wall, about that high, and of course that was good for the sand. After each sandstorm we all went out, and the blankets that we had to shake the sand out of them before we could go to sleep.
So when did you leave Hay?
In May 1941, and we were sent then to Tatura, because it was agreed that the climate in Hay was not the best, especially for the elder ones amongst us. You know. The oldies, they were about 40 or 50 years old at the time. And I don't think I could stand it today either. And a little sidelight to that is we had a reunion in Hay in 1990, the 50th year after our internment, and we talked to the locals. Some of them remember the camp, they were old enough, and I said, we remember the sandstorm. Sandstorm? We haven't had any for 30 years. It's all green, look at it, it's lush green. They were growing lettuces for the Melbourne market in Hay. It was all lush and green. And they said, you haven't had anything for 30 years? Well, there's the first, look at it, it's coming up. You didn't have to go to that trouble.
Did you have any contact with the locals?
We did. Well, there's some that came into the camp to deliver firewood for the kitchen and so on. In fact, one of the guys I met in 1990 said, I used to deliver firewood for the kitchen. I said, yeah, and I used to carve it into animals.
So you then came to Tatura. Did everybody leave Hay?
No, that was in drips and drops. Quite a few were sent to a camp in Orange in New South Wales. They were the people that had still hopes or had paperwork to carry on that they could migrate to the States. I mean, it never came to anything, but they thought Orange was a bit closer to the States than Tatura and Victoria. And quite a few friends left, were separated. We went to Tatura, and we first came to a camp, camp number 3, which was, unbeknown to us, the family camp. It was divided into 4 quarters, each for 250 people, and one quarter had the couples or the families that were interned and sent here from Singapore. So we got there in the middle of the night. It was dark, it was blackout, just enough light for us to march along the dividing gangway. All of a sudden we heard a female voice, "Seid ihr Juden? Hey, women?" 18 years old, 19 maybe. But we were well and truly separated. But we only left, and we had each cubicles because it was a camp made for families or for couples. And then 2 weeks later they sent us to Tatura number 2, which was again like Hay. The only difference was the climate was better, and the huts were made from corrugated iron instead of timber. Other than that, the setup was the same. And that's another 8 months there.
What did you do while you were there?
Carry on carving, carry on going to English classes, learning how to sketch, to design, and go to the camp workshop, where others went to camp school and laid the foundation for their further academic career.
There were no work duties?
No,
Work duties?
there were a lot of people, there was a lot of work in camp, in the kitchen and all this, and they got their sixpence a week. As long as I could earn two shillings or more with carving, why should I settle for sixpence a week? There were plenty. I didn't want to take jobs away from the others.
What was the environment like?
In Tatura?
Yes.
It was very nice. There were trees in the camp and around the camp and no sandstorm. The climate didn't tend to go to extremes, and it was quite bearable, except that we still wanted to get out.
How did you get from Hay to Tatura?
They put us on a train from Hay. Then we had a stop in, I think it was Narendra, where they took us into the railway refreshment room, and we each had a cup of tea and a sandwich. And funny episode is one of the boys killed himself laughing when we left. I said, "What's so funny?" He said, "I left a tip for the waitress. She left a penny under the plate." We had no money in the camp. A penny in halfpennies we did have, the real Australian money. But anything above that, we had like movie theater tickets, a sixpence, a shilling. That was the money in our camp. The other camp in Hay had money printed outside, which is by now very valuable, collector's items. But I was in the wrong camp. I haven't got any.
So it wasn't money as such, it was token money that you
There
had?
was token money, yeah, except for halfpennies and pennies.
Your mood seemed rather happy
Yes,
at this stage.
the move was very happy because we knew the climate was going to be better. And we were away from the sandstorms, although by now, other than that, life had become tolerable in Hay. But Hay, Tatura was better. And by that time, they also had this Major Leighton from England who was actively working with the British and Australian government to see what could be done to get us out, because it had dawned even on Australia by that time that we were on the Allies' side.
So how did things progress from there?
Well, it progressed rather slowly, much too slow for us, because I was in two minds about returning to England. We could occasionally get papers, and we knew what was going on in Europe, that by that time the Nazis had invaded Russia and all this sort of thing. And Europe was rather hot to be there. And we thought, well, if we could stay in Australia, it would be much better, although it's far away from our parents. And then after Pearl Harbor, of course, that was the end of that. There was no more shipping available to go from Australia to Europe for non-essential purposes. So, but by that time, the Australian government had also realized after Pearl Harbor that they need every pair of hands they can get. And they said, well, it's stupid keeping these people here. We let them land in Australia, and we got the opportunity to join for the famous 8th Australian Employment Company.
Being?
Deliberate error. Freudian slip.
You joined the Australian Army?
Yes, we joined the Australian Army, but somehow, while we were Australian uniform, they didn't quite trust us with rifles. And quite a few of the fellows volunteered to be transferred to other branches. No go. I think one or two had special skills as interpreter or whatever they did, but the others, no. In contrast, in England, they joined the British Pioneer Corps, and from there could transfer. And I've heard of a case, we had one guy who was a boxer, supremely fit, went to the Pioneer Corps, transferred to the commandos, did everything right, got a commission in the field, became a captain, had a couple of medals for bravery, was involved in the landing in Italy in Anzio, and was wounded, not fatally, but enough to have to leave the army. And when he was demobilized, he had to report to the police every week as an enemy alien. In that sense, the Aussies did not treat us quite like that.
Are you still with many of your original Ort boys?
Yes. We have a meeting once a year. We get together. I mean, apart from any individual friendships where we get together, once a year on Australia Day we get together. There's 16 of us left in Melbourne, 2 in Sydney, 1 in Brisbane. Well, they don't come to Melbourne as a rule unless we travel up. Originally there were 39 sent here. Well, some have moved on to the States, 1 or 2 even went back to Germany. Unfortunately, a few have already passed away.
Do you keep in contact with many of them outside Australia?
Not with many, but a few. Few of the friendships that were formed have lasted the distance by correspondence. 1 or 2 have visited here. I've visited a few when I was overseas. And we keep in touch.
So how long were you in the army?
4 years and 4 months. I went in April 42. I got out August 46.
And what did you do while you were in the army?
Well, I can best describe it as coolies in uniform. We worked in Victoria or at the border, Albury or Toowoomba, transshipping supplies for the forces. Now that could be ammunition, that could be food, that could be anything that an army needs. And sort of work to keep the army in the field going. By that time they had moved into New Guinea and even further out, and they needed all sorts of things that were either manufactured in Victoria or imported, collected from other states. I don't think that there was much importing going on. And we were sent to working parties wherever we were needed, occasionally even for the American army initially, while the Yanks were based here. They moved up north too, but basically it really is a supply or service organization.
Did you feel any discrimination?
Very, very slight on a very much milder scale, and I think it was mainly based because the average Aussie or the Aussie soldiers didn't quite know what to make of us. Here were people that were Australian uniform, worked under the same condition as an Australian soldier, but had a heavy accent, didn't go to races all the time, or didn't play Aussie rural football. A completely strange mob. At least the other so-called bloody foreigners wore their own uniform, whether they from the Dutch East Indies, they were Dutch uniform. You had the Yanks, but they couldn't work us out. And we became a little self-conscious because of it.
Did you develop friendships with the Australians?
Yes, yes. A lot of people that we worked with and were in camp with, they were friendships, I would say in some cases lasted a few years, in other cases they lasted while we were together and then fizzled out. But oh yes, we did everything we could to become dinkomized.
What happened after you were demobilized?
After I got demobilized, I started a job practically immediately, because before I was demobilized, I met a guy who was also a Donera boy, who was to become my boss for many, many years, and my friend for even more. We still see him. He knew that I was wood carving, and he had artistic leanings, and he said, listen, at the moment I'm working in a war plant, I'm under manpower control, I've got to stick there. When manpower controls are lifted, I want to set up a workshop, wood turning, wooden bowls, wooden platters and things like that. Would you like to try your hand at it? I said, well, what have I got to lose? He said, you've got some artistic leanings, try it, no commitment. If you don't like it, you can go. If you do like it, you can stay. I liked it, I stayed. He hasn't been able to get rid of me since. So for 10 years I did wood turning, craft work with timber, which was right up my alley, until Japanese imports came in 10 years later and killed it, and he promoted me into the office, and I didn't even know how to hold a biro. I learned.
Did you work between leaving to Tura and going into the army?
Yes, when we left Tura, the army wasn't quite ready for us, which I can understand in retrospect. They sent us fruit picking in the Goulburn Valley for 2 months. It was just at the height of the fruit picking season. And then that was between end of January and early April 42. And by that time the army was ready for us, and then we moved into Caulfield's Racecourse, where we slept on the grandstand.
We'll just break for a change of tape. Tape number 4 with Mr. Kurt Lewinski. What happened after demobilisation?
Well, after demobilization, for the first time in many, many years, I had a living to earn. I had to start the life afresh as a civilian, and I rented a room somewhere in East Melbourne and went to work, and really found that I liked wood turning, that it was right up my alley, so I'm afraid that Fred Lowen wasn't going to get rid of me straight away. And of course, we joined the social life. By that time, I've made friends in Melbourne, like all the other Dunera boys. They've all established contact, met people. Some of them, by the time I got out of the army, had even married. A good friend of mine with whom I've been together since Berlin, he married in January 44. I couldn't wait. I could.
You mentioned the name of the man that you worked for.
Yes.
What was the name of the company?
At that time, the company was called Fleur, F-L-E-R, which was the initials of Fred Lowen and his partner, Ernest Rodek, both Dunera boys. It started in an old stable in Richmond somewhere, but it grew from there, and it became quite a sizable company until they sold it in the late 60s. And then Fred Lowen started again, this time with his brother, a company which was called first Twin and then Tessa.
And you were making?
They were making first woodware at Fleur, then they branched into furniture, which quickly outstripped the woodware, the wooden turned articles, in turnover. Then when the woodware folded, it became exclusively furniture, and it stayed furniture ever since.
So you had a network of friends here in Melbourne.
Yes.
You married yourself?
Well, eventually, yes. I was introduced to a young lady in 1947 through a friend of mine, and was invited to some of his friends' places. I said, how come? I really haven't got any contact with the people. I know them. But I said, look, I don't know. That's my wife and his wife cooked something up. I think you're supposed to meet a friend. And I got in there, and in walked Mrs. Jacob. I said, I'm supposed to meet a young lady, Mrs. Jacob? What do I do with a married lady? Little did I know, but in the course of that evening it turned out that Mrs. Jacob was a widow who has been through Auschwitz and lost her husband during the war in the Holocaust. And we became firm friends, and we have now been married 48 years.
What's her name, her first name?
Her name is Zenta, and somehow we clicked. And ever since I've heard Zenta's story, I find that Dunera was a picnic compared to what she's been through.
Where is Zenta from? Where is she from?
Zenta was born in Berlin, but grew up in a small German town called Jastrow in the eastern part. It is now Poland. And after the war, she lived in Hamburg and in Munich and couldn't get out of Germany quick enough. And she was very lucky. She met up with the brother of her late husband, who had a fiancée here in Australia that got the permit for him, and he said, I won't leave Zenta in Germany. I promised it to my brother. Can I take her with me? So they got a permit for Zenta. That was the end of my freedom.
What was her maiden name?
Her maiden name was Freundlich, which translated into English says friendly, and she married Alfred Jacob.
And when was she born?
She was born in January 1921.
Do you have any children?
No, we have no children.
Just going back a little, how did you feel here when they announced that war had ended?
I felt relieved on VE Day, when the war in Europe had ended, that finally they got rid of the Nazis. I mean, you could predict that the end would be coming for a year or two. And when the war in Japan ended, I said, well, at last, now we can go back to normal, whatever normal is.
Did you mix mainly within the Jewish community or in the general community?
I'm sorry?
Did you mix mainly in the Jewish community?
I think I can safely say in both. Although lately I think I'm more together with Jewish people rather than the general community.
And your early life in Melbourne?
Early life in Melbourne, it was first with the Jewish community, because on the first Saturday in the army, we went what the army called church parade, but we went to synagogue. And we met people there. They invited me right throughout the war and later every second Friday night for Shabbat. They were very highly Orthodox, and I respect them, although I'm not Orthodox. But I, on one occasion, grabbed the milchige towel for the fleischige plate. That was, of course, not the done thing. I showed my ignorance.
And how would you describe your religious life here now?
Not very religious, rather irreverently. Revolving door Jews, in on Rosh Hashanah and out on Yom Kippur. Probably not quite that drastic, but being Jewish, apart from the religious aspect, I was born a Jew, and my family suffered because we were Jews, and we are Jews, and we're going to stay that way.
Are you involved in any clubs or organisations?
Not really.
You said you met with the De Niro boys.
Yes.
Often.
Well, we meet, we have our annual reunion, but of course we socialize with quite a few of them in between. We also meet once a year with the Old boys, the few that are left, and we again, with a few of them, we meet in between. And as old people usually do, all we do is reminisce. And I used to hate when my father did it with his cronies. Now I'm doing it.
Did you hear from your family?
Did I?
Hear from your family?
Hear?
Did you hear from them news from Europe after the war?
Well, my family perished in the Holocaust. And I did have cousins who went to Palestine and Israel, and of course I resumed contact with them.
How did you hear about what happened to your parents?
It started, I think, after the war. I think all of us placed search notices, contacted the Red Cross, Jewish organization, whatever could be found. They had places in Germany where they registered survivors, and of course it soon became obvious that my family has not survived. And then through the Red Cross I had a notice from a lady who was together with my sister Gerda, first in Riga, and then when they were sent to Stutthof, where Gerda was killed. And she said, yes, I was there, I remember her. That's the only thing I heard. And from my parents, they were deported late November 41 to Riga and have never been heard from. I had the search places organized. I had a lawyer in Berlin who also organized inquiries, and the result was negative.
And you'd always kept in contact with your sister who'd gone to Canada?
Yes. My sister, in fact, if I can go back a little bit, when she was in London and I was in the Kitchener camp, I then went to Leeds. We kept in touch. Then Thea was interned in London before I was interned in Leeds. And she was, in the Isle of Man, she was 5 miles away from me at the same time, but I got no permission to visit her. And then I came here on the Doneran. The first time I saw Thea again was in 1964 when she got impatient and visited us here because she said, "You'll never come to visit us," because 2 years later I had my long service leave and did visit them.
Have you been back to your hometown?
I have. In 1966 we went round the world, and among other things we went to both Marienwerder and to Jastrow, Zenda's hometown. And that cured me completely of what little nostalgia I might have had, because Marienwerder, the center was destroyed, including the parental home. It just was plain empty field. Jastrow, that's completely unchanged. Zenda's parental home is still in existence, and of course Polish people live there, who themselves were sent there from the part that was originally East Poland and is now West Russia. And they were moved west, just as the Germans were moved west.
How did you find in your early years was the attitude of the Australian population when you came into Melbourne? Was there any anti-Semitism?
There was a little bit. I didn't have any direct contact with it. In fact, the main anti-Semitism was when we were still in the camp and the debates were raging in both federal and Victorian Parliament whether we should be released. And there were quite a number of parliamentarians who openly spoke out against, "No, send them back, we don't want them here."
And how do you think the Holocaust experience affected your transition into post-war life?
Well, that's a bit difficult to describe. I mean, the Holocaust was really, for me, it cut off my early life. My parents, my sister had disappeared. The remnant, there was a remnant left in that Thea survived and that a few cousins survived. But I knew that my life from then on would be totally different to my upbringing. And that I, if I wanted to continue, had to adapt.
Do you often think back on your childhood?
Yes, I do. Voluntarily or even involuntarily, because I think that is most people, as you get older, your past keeps getting longer and your future keeps getting shorter. So there's more in your past and you more to think about.
Are they fond memories?
Very fond memories. Very fun. As I mentioned before, I was spoiled rotten as a kid. And I had a happy childhood and a happy youth. And it was only drastically changed by circumstances beyond my control.
Do you ever think of what might have been?
I do, but it's conjecture, and I must say that if I'm to be brutally honest about it, leaving all sentimentality aside, I would, if it hadn't been for the Holocaust, I would probably by now be also in retirement after having been the owner of a clothing store in a small provincial German town.
You think things would have gone on much the same?
I might have gone on slightly built on it, like my father built on what his father founded. But I don't think I would have ever moved in the way that I did move, was forced to move by circumstances.
What made you tell your story today?
Well, as a matter of fact, I heard of the Shoah Foundation, and when Zenta was interviewed, I thought, well, she should tell her story to counteract any potential future Holocaust or anti-Semitism. But I never considered myself as a Holocaust survivor because I was lucky enough to have been here while the Holocaust was going on. But I was persuaded to give this interview, that my story is worth telling. Well, I may not agree, but I'm telling it.
No, it's well worth telling. It's your relocation because of what happened in Europe at the time. As you said, your life.
I got caught up in history.
Now that 50 years have passed, is there a message you'd like to give to future generations?
Well, the message is that we should always be not only tolerant towards others, but we should also be very much vigilant against intolerance, because it can build, given the right circumstances, into something like the Holocaust. I can still remember my father, who, like most Yickers, was 150% German, of the Jewish faith, but still 150% German. When Hitler came to power, he said, he won't last till Christmas. But he did last till Christmas. And the next year he said, okay, he lasted now, won't last till this Christmas. And this went on year after year. By the time my father realized that he's going to last, it was too late to do much about it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewinski. Mr. Lewinski, would you like to introduce your wife?
Yes, this is my better half, Zenta, who prefers not to talk. My wife for 48 years. She deserves a medal for putting up with me.
What challenges have you faced together as a result of your experiences?
I think the biggest challenge was to live a happy and fruitful life together. And I've also tried to take part in Zenta's rehabilitation after her Holocaust experiences, to bring her back to normal. I like to think I've succeeded.
Did she have great difficulty in the early days?
No, none at all. Just making life as normal as possible was enough of a challenge in the initial stages.
And now?
Now it's happy Darby and Joan existence.
Thank you. Can you tell us about this, please?
Yes, that is my birth certificate.
You're born?
Born 11th of December 1921. Although my father had this made out, it's a copy made out in 1938. Hence the swastika and the additional name of Israel. That's the photo of the parental home, which had the shop on the ground floor and we lived above it. It's an old photo. I can't put the date on it, but it's probably taken before I was born.
What was the name of the family business?
It was called B.M. Lewinski, grandfather's name. And that's a page from a family album from my early history.
What have you put in this diary?
I put in photos or any documentation or letters that I could scrounge from anywhere to tell the story of my family.
And who is now in this photo?
In this photo, there's my parents at the back, my two sisters and myself. This would be taken around about 1935, if I can remember correctly.
On the left?
On the left is my mother, my father on the right. In the foreground on the left, my sister Thea, then myself, and then my sister Gerda. That is a photo of my father and four of his sisters. I remember seeing two of them. I never met the other two. The two in the back I have met.
Their names?
The name is on the left in the back is Aunt Jenny, who lived in Hamburg. And the other one's name was Amalia. We called her Muli. I met her again in Israel. They lived in Berlin and then moved to Israel.
And the names of the other two?
And the other two is Aunt Paula and Ruth and Gertrude. I don't recall ever having met them. That's our local synagogue, which was only built and inaugurated in the either very late 20s or the early 30s. This was taken, I think, on Rosh Hashanah, and it was the custom for the men to wear top hats.
This is in Marienwerder.
In Marienwerder, yes. They have family outings. We went there by car in a nearby forest. We did that quite frequently. On this photo from the left, my sister Gerda, my sister Thea, myself, a cousin Margot, and my mother, and the family car. That's another outing in the forest with our General Factotum, who was driver, and General Rouseabout at home. And interesting fact is that the little boy on the right later on became an officer in the Israeli Navy and the Israeli Naval Attaché at the Bonn Embassy in Germany.
His name?
His name is Rudi Rehan, although he's probably got an Israeli name by now. I don't know what it is.
And what was the name of the driver?
There was also Rudolf Bolz. He was a German. These two photos were taken at my parents' silver wedding in February 38. It was the last time that we were together in the parental home. We met later on, but that was the last time when we were all together. They are my two sisters and myself. I was getting to be reasonably grown up. I think they might have been my first long pants.
And your sister on the left is?
My sister is Gerda on the left and Thea in the middle. Thea was on a visit from Berlin, where she was living at that time. In April 38, I came to Berlin and attended the art school, and there's a group of the boys taken at that time. I'm on the back row, the fifth from the left. Wasn't wearing glasses then.
And what was the name of the man at the art school?
The business manager's name was Werner Simon, who really was very instrumental in getting us out. In fact, when we left Berlin, he was at the train station and he was haranguing a Gestapo official. We feared for his safety the way he was about it. He achieved the fact that we got out, but he perished himself, unfortunately. This is a document that was issued by the Central Office for Jewish Immigration in Berlin. One of the documents that you had to have before you could even apply for a passport, to show that the Germans had no objection to you leaving. This is a similar document which the German police had to issue, again to show that you had no criminal record and that there's no objection to you getting out. That is a group photo taken of the 100 old boys a day after we arrived in the Kitchener camp in England, and I'm on that photo. We were all very glad to have been in England at that time. These are some pencil drawing that I did at a later stage in the Hague camp from original photographs. They're just pencil drawings showing our accommodation in Leeds. That on the left is the main hostel, where we went for meals and for any classes or social get-together. Now we're moving. That's a view of a part of the garden, a very small part. In the background there's a couple of little cottages which also accommodated us. I was in one of them. And that is the green cottage which housed 18 of the boys, all set in the very spacious gardens. It was taken in the photo, or original photo was taken in winter time when everything was snow covered. That was the room for 6 of our boys that I was in. There were 3 of these double bunk metal beds. And this is another sketch of the green cottage which housed 18 of us.
Below the pub.
This on the left was a lino cut made in the Hague camp. It shows a view out of the window of one of the huts. I can't remember the name of the artist, but it really did look like that. And when the windows were open, of course, that was even better for the sandstorms to come in. On the right is a pencil sketch of me done by an artist whose name I also forget, I must admit. That is reasonably accurate. In the internment camp I wrote a diary, and I wrote it in German, later on translated it to English. This is the front page, and it reproduces some of the English newspaper headlines which appeared before we were interned. There was a whole campaign working up into mass hysteria, understandable under the circumstances. But it wasn't nice to be on the receiving end just the same.
When did you start the diary?
Actually on the Donera, and then later on I, from memory, wrote back the prologue, which was leading up to it, and then carried it on right throughout the internment camp. But that was it then, no more diary. This is one of the chapters. It says, "Innocent Behind Barbed Wire, a diary and notes of my internment." That's a chapter about the Donera. It's been well documented by lots of people, but these are just my own notes, which contributed to the general story. I must admit the sketch is slightly faked because I was never in a hammock on the Donera. But it looks good as a headline. When I drew this sketch, the dawn of a new year, I was hopeful that we'd be free before the year was out. I was just a little bit early. We only got out of 42. Some Melbourne Australian friends asked me to read the diary, and for them I translated the whole thing into English. And 19 wasted months was how I felt at the time, although in retrospect I must say they were not really wasted. They gave me a foundation for my later life.
Where did you get all the equipment to make the original diary, the books, the paper?
Oh, you could buy books. We had a canteen where you could buy food, you could buy notes and paper. I mean, not in the first couple of months, but it gradually came, and you earned money and you bought whatever you needed.
They didn't give you anything?
Oh, no. They gave us food and clothing, but those things we had to buy. And here's a recent photo of my sister Thea, taken in June 1996. She lives in Toronto in Canada.
She's married?
No, widowed.
Has children?
One child, one son rather, and 2 grandchildren.